Hello and welcome to the Supernatural Track here at Continual. I'm your host, Gail Martin, and tonight we are talking about the season 5 road trip. Where did the boys go? Why did they pick those towns and cities? Which were fictional, which were not, and what little Easter eggs got tucked in there with some of the town and city choices. But before we get into that, let's have our wonderful panelists introduce themselves, starting with Carole.
Hi, I'm Carole Stokes. I've been a Supernatural fan since season 3. I started writing fan fiction in 2012, and I love doing Supernatural panels.
And Elektra.
I'm Elektra Hammond. I'm a writer and an editor, and I've been with Supernatural since that very first episode.
I'm Gail Martin and Morgan Bryce. I write urban and epic fantasy as Gail and urban fantasy male romance as Morgan, and all my modern worlds are ones Sam and Dean could walk into and feel right at home. I fell in love with the show halfway through season 11, binge watched 11 seasons in time for the start of season 12, and haven't looked back since then. So season 5 locations, you know, I have to snicker because right there at the beginning for Sympathy for the Devil is hell, Lucifer's cage. Well, of course it is, because this is Supernatural and that's how we roll. But before we start looking episode by episode, what are some of the memorable locations for you and why? Carole?
Well, Stull Cemetery. In the finale, the final showdown happens in Stull Cemetery in Kansas, and that's certainly very memorable. It's where they open the portal to throw Lucifer back in the cage. Unfortunately, he grabs Sam as he goes, and so they fall together into the depths to be locked together in the cage. And just the way they were shooting it and just the whole scenery of it is just terrific. I mean, it's, you know, kind of like your blasted heath, you know, like your Sarah Meadow and iron, you know, a rickety iron gate with a name tag, you know, and the old worn grave markers and everything. So it's a really picturesque scene, and apparently redolent with its own occult history. It had this whole little history of, you know, it was a little town, and at one point there was a church, and then the church got moved, and then the old church like fell apart, and at some point people started to say that the devil would appear there and the shenanigans would happen, and that it was, the legend became that it was in fact a portal to hell. So I really liked just the visual aspects of when we approach Stull. Of course, Sam's just bopped there, but when Dean is driving up to it and he drives through that gate and he starts blasting the music and rolling through the meadow, it's a great visual. And it was just really then interesting to find out it actually kind of had this quasi cult, and I'm sure that's why they picked it. I mean, you know, I'm sure they did their research too, but I didn't know that when I first watched it. So I believe they even comment on it that it has this dark history, and I'm just like, yeah. I didn't even think it was a real place, but it is. It is a real place, and it does have that history. So knowing that really kind of rounds that whole experience out for me. Portal to hell, and more picturesque than Cleveland.
Interestingly or disturbingly, if you Google Hellgate, it is not just a Buffy term or a supernatural term. There are a number of places that are said to have multiple gates to hell. Brazil, Indiana, good luck finding it on a map. York, Pennsylvania has 7 of them. And there are more.
That's not surprising. Have you been to York?
Yes, I have.
I've been there. It doesn't surprise me at all. But yeah, it's only a matter of doing research. I mean, people have been worried about witches and the devil for forever, long before there was supernatural.
Yeah,
The occult predates our favorite TV show. I'm sorry, but
shocking.
it does.
Do you
And
have
there-
some? Do you have a favorite location or two?
Yeah, I had always assumed that Pike Creek was down further south than I am, and even lower and even slower Delaware. And I discovered that no, it's in Newcastle County with me, and it's 30 or 40 minutes away. It's one town over from where my mother-in-law was. So road trip. I think I need to go up there and drive around just for my own peace of mind to see what it actually looks like, because it's like in my backyard. I need to go see where Lucifer's from. I just assumed it was, there's a lot of lower, slower Delaware where the towns are far apart.
Mm-hmm.
And this one is actually not that far from me. And it's fairly well populated. It's apparently a very important town as far as the census is concerned.
Interesting.
It's a big deal. Which may have been why they picked it. If you try and Google towns in Delaware, that one comes up.
You know, the one that always fascinates me is, and it claims to be a fictional location, and I think that's, the camp itself is fictional. But in the episode, The End, when Dean gets a glimpse of the apocalyptic future, there's Camp Chautauqua, and it's supposed to be in Kansas City, Missouri. Now, having grown up in northwestern Pennsylvania, hop, skip, and a jump from northwestern New York, of course, my brain always transposes that to Chautauqua, which is a real place, which was it got a few extra vowels and another syllable in there. But it was a notable arts community and place that held a lot of highbrow lectures and brought in speakers all through the 1800s. So every time Dean's doing this Camp Chautauqua, I have this much more upscale view in my head from Chautauqua, New York. But alas, Camp Chautauqua is in Kansas City, Missouri. So I could never hear that without having to do the mental gymnastics to reprogram myself. What other places stuck out to you? We see a lot of familiar ones like, Ilchester, Maryland, which we talked about last time with the church and the whole really horrible lore about a real church and convent in Ilchester where there was a massacre. What else? Because
We
we're
spend
all
an
over the
awful
place.
lot of time in Sioux City with Bobby.
Mhm.
As
Sioux
we should. We should spend more, in Sioux Falls. We should spend more time with Bobby. More Bobby is good.
Yeah. It was interesting. I was just reading a fan fiction and they mentioned not having access to the panic room anymore. This was taking place in one of the later seasons because it was buried under the rubble of Bobby's house, which then made me wonder, well, that would be a kind of handy thing to have if the place wasn't infested by demons. Surely they would have gone and tried to salvage everything of Bobby's value, the books, the relics, anything like that they could dig out. And while it isn't Sam's favorite place by a long stretch, I'm thinking that digging out that door might come in handy at some point. So that just got me thinking about things they never really came back to in the series.
I could see them doing that too, because, once they were established at the bunker, that would almost make sense that they would be like, well, let's go now that we have a place to bring them. I mean, they couldn't do anything before because they didn't have a home base, but that actually would really make sense that once they did, they could say, you know what, well, let's go back and see what, if there's anything left, anything salvageable. Interesting.
In my
From
head,
all
Hannah,
the
little
spots
note.
they knew of.
yeah,
From not just Bobby's, but from the Campbells too.
Mhm.
well, and
Yeah, because he had that little hidey hole too.
And
can't
hunt down
determine.
all the chapter houses, because there are no more American Men of Letters. They're not using them. The boys are legacies. Surely there was more than just the one that they found.
That we know of.
That we
They
know of.
needed to hunt down those chapter houses because for all they knew, there were still men of letters in some of them who thought they were the only ones. The way they thought they were the only ones left. They were newcomers.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there were somebody cut off whose family legacy it was.
Yeah.
Could have been a
Or-
whole nother thing.
Or somebody who decided to sit out the apocalypse in their own safe place, and kind of like that guy in World War II didn't come out of the cave for 30 years. You know, maybe there's been some guy, who's been down there since.
dear.
Somebody who's actually learned the lore from their father and taught it to their kids. And they watched over the chapter house and they maintained things, and they may or may not have been working with local hunters, but everybody kept the secrets like you were supposed to. Maybe there really is somebody in an isolated part of the country. I mean, I realize the boys do get to most of those little towns, but there might have been, they weren't really walking around saying we're men of letters now.
Mm-hmm.
They were well-known hunters who also were known for getting into a lot of trouble. And that was something men of letters avoided.
Yeah.
This is
Just
a whole nother spin-off,
Yeah.
or somebody should write a fanfic about it, because I'm not going to.
I liked in the real Ghostbusters, there was another great instance of supernatural taking an actual urban legend. In the town of Vermillion, there was an orphanage, and the orphanage burnt down. Subsequently, rumors began to get spun around, and again, local legend became that children had been murdered there, and that it was haunted and everything. So the Gore orphanage that we see in the episode was a real orphanage, and it was the town of at one point it was like the town of Gore, or Gore was right around there. Not Gore as in bloody, but Gore as in like a piece of land, like terminology we don't use anymore. But back in the 1800s, they did. But yes,
Yeah, we still use it.
It really was an orphanage. It burnt down. It really had these legends about it. And so that's why Chuck and Becky chose it to have their convention at. And I just thought that was great, because once again, I thought this whole thing was just all the writer's imagination. And then looking into it, it was like, oh my gosh, again, they really did find some kind of place that had a little nugget of its own spooky legend, and used it, because of course we have Letitia Gore and the kids, and we think she murdered the kids. And then of course it turns out that she was keeping the kids from murdering people, which was a great little twist. Yeah, so that was the setting for that. And I really enjoyed that they didn't just throw a dart on a map for that one.
It was nice.
Go ahead.
It was nice that they were pushing the idea of don't make assumptions,
Mhm.
because you really shouldn't ever. You should always investigate and look at the evidence and never assume who the aggressor is and who the victim is. You have to ask. And
Yeah.
it's assumptions that are getting us into trouble with everything.
Well, and one of the ones that caught my eye was the in Sam Interrupted, the Glenwood Springs Psychiatric Hospital that is supposedly in Ketchum, Oklahoma. There is talk about going down a rabbit hole. There is a website called the Asylum Project, and make sure if you go looking for it, you find the right one, because several other things unrelated to tracking old historic hospitals have that name also in completely different purposes. But this site is attempting to document all of these psychiatric hospitals, tuberculosis sanitariums, reform schools, courthouses, all of those kinds of institutions, many of which have been torn down, but a surprising number of which are still standing, have been repurposed, even if they're or are abandoned and still declining. And so that's always my go-to place to look up some of these hospitals and say, if it wasn't real, was it based on something? And what I found was there was an Eastern Oklahoma hospital for the criminally insane. It wasn't in Glenwood Springs, it wasn't in Ketchum, but I'm betting that they borrowed liberally from its history because it's also said to be haunted by the spirits of dead children. So none of these were happy places. And that always makes me wonder when a developer buys it and goes, we're going to turn this into condos. Have you watched any movies?
Question, the Asylum Project. What is it out there for besides so that people writing TV shows and cozy mysteries can do research?
I think it's out there to document places before they're totally forgotten and vanish from memory. And
Okay,
most of the ones that are, so many of them that are out there are those big sprawling, the kind that we think of when you say Victorian mental institution, the massive Kirkbride building that looks like a mansion, only not a nice one.
it's the places where people put the family members they were embarrassed about and wanted to get rid of.
Right, the inconvenience.
Because it's what you did. You paid some money to have it taken care of so you didn't have to deal with it at home. Because we didn't have, you couldn't go and get counseling once a week the way you can now.
Right.
We didn't recognize a lot of illnesses, and we didn't have the sort of drugs that you can take that will even off somebody that's bipolar. So that was how they dealt with it back then.
Right.
They drugged you into somnolence and walked you around a little and tried to pretend that they were doing the best they could.
Or they had orphanages with kids that nobody wanted, or they had sanatoriums were big for a long time before they got drugs that could treat tuberculosis, where it was thought that if you could get people out of the bad air in the city, and someplace, especially up in the mountains where they could get fresh air, maybe it would ease their symptoms, not cure them, but extend their life, make it a little more pleasant, because they really didn't have any treatments for these things. And of course, an awful lot of people died there. So prime haunting places. And but yeah, if you're looking, if you really want to be creeped out and find a whole lot of places that now this doesn't document urban legends about them or anything like that, but it is a prime writing tool if you want to find some creepy former asylums, and that's always kind of a go-to when I start a book is, okay, was there a real one there I can borrow from? But we digress. The Glenwood Psychological Hospital is not in Ketchum Springs. What else? Like you said, Elektra, there's a lot in Sioux Falls.
There are an awful lot. And also we go home to Lawrence,
Mm-hmm.
which is always fun going home, even if you never can go home again. And kudos for using The Song Remains the Same as an episode title, because we've been talking over on Facebook about Led Zepp lyrics all day. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, surprising number of this season's episodes happen in Sioux Falls, but we've also got 2 trips to Kripke's Hollow, Ohio, which is a fictional town.
I just love that.
Named for
but one we love.
He's hollow.
but one we love. And
Ooh, yeah.
they hit Ohio a lot. They're in Wellington, Ohio for changing channels. They're in Vermilion, Ohio for the real Ghostbusters.
But I
There,
could see that that actually makes sense to me, because I would think, and when we see a lot of instances where they had a case and then they had to go drive, you know, halfway across the country. But I mean, if they're in an area and there's other stuff happening nearby, why wouldn't, you know, like, you would want to kind of stay in that radius for convenience's sake. Well, I can go here, or I could just go 50 miles away and take care of that thing. You know?
except
So I'm surprised sometimes we don't see more of it, although at least we do see it, I think, like maybe they're in the Midwest for a while and then they suddenly go east or west. But yeah, here there was a few in Ohio. I also found, to me, it struck me, let's start that all over again. It struck me as I looked through this that there was a lot more teeny tiny towns, like really little towns.
Garber, Oklahoma.
Oh, is that the one that has like 500 people? Oh, under 1,000. There's another one that had like 500 people. I mean,
That,
so
that was
a
Blue
lot
Earth,
of
maybe,
these, it was
where they
where?
had the militia.
I'm not sure, but there was a lot of little towns. And the only time they're in big town or big cities is when something really, really major is happening in the storyline. So they're in all these little towns, and then they go to Detroit, you know, for Sam to say yes. And they go to Chicago to meet Death. But then they're in all these little towns again. And I just, to me, it kind of mapped out what was happening storyline wise with like the sizes of the towns they were going through. And I feel like this is the first time I really saw that happening. We've seen them in a large variety of places, of course, but here it just really seemed to follow that, you know, case. Oh, they meet Death, you know, case. Oh, devil time. That's when they hit the big cities.
Well, we did have Carthage, Missouri, which we've commented on before. That's shown up in more than one episode, but there was a horrific Civil War battle that happened there. So kind of tracking with that idea of death and violent death and unresolved conflict, that seemed like a good place to go try to kill the devil. Although I have to laugh, your theory about staying in an area is blown apart between Sam interrupted, swap meet, and the song remains the same when they start in Oklahoma, go to Massachusetts, and come back to Kansas.
Oh, no, absolutely. They do a lot of that. And I'm sure it was unavoidable. But, you know, just I would think sometimes there are times where, like in previous seasons, we'd see where maybe they were in the Midwest. And so maybe they were in Iowa and then Nebraska and then Oklahoma, and then maybe they went back up to Illinois, but at least they're kind of still in that central area of the country before they get yanked out to go to Colorado or Maine or something. So yeah, I'm sure there's times where it was just like, oh, well, luck of the draw. You know, that's where they gotta go.
Question, the people running the show, where are they from?
Some of them had to have had small town background.
No, what countries are they from? This one?
I think so.
Yeah, I think they're mostly Americans.
I mean, Serge Lecoder, the camera visuals guy, he's from Montreal. But they're either US or Canada, I would think.
Okay. I had a friend from Maine who at some point had someone from the UK come and visit her. And people from Europe, and especially the United Kingdom, sometimes have an issue with the size of the United States. And this friend said, I'd like to go down to Florida. Can we drive down there for the afternoon? She was from the Jersey Islands. She had no idea of the size of the US. And it did not occur to her that this was not something you could do to drive down to Florida from Maine and come back in a day. Well, they don't get the scale because they come from a country that's the size of New Jersey.
Right.
And although it's very hard to drive all the way across it and back because they don't have interstates. They have windy little roads you don't want to drive fast on at night.
With
Right.
sheep. With sheep on
But
it.
in actual mileage, as the crow flies, it would not be a long drive. Well, I mean, I think Canadians, Australians, Americans, and Russians all kind of get the idea of land mass.
Well, we don't have the same, you can't, we did a show at one point in Moscow one weekend, and then we had to fly to Siberia the following weekend to judge another show because it's 2 time zones away. And it's in the same country. Russia, or 5 time zones away. Russia makes us look small.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
it's immensely long and big, and
well, and a lot of, I mean, Australia, it's difficult, if not impossible, to just drive across the middle because
no, you can only drive up and down the coast.
Yeah, or around.
Where all the population is.
And Canada has, yes, you can get there, but there are some parts of Canada you can't just take a straight shot through because there are waterways and lakes and tundra.
The boys apparently picked up and just drove up to Alaska across Canada.
I always wondered how they got across the border with everything in the trunk.
And their IDs, yeah. Well, they must have done an illegal border crossing. There's no other explanation.
It's a fairly porous border in the rural areas and a little magic. And
they did not pull up to a regular border crossing and flip some of those fake FBI IDs and said, we want to come into Canada. I've been stopped at the border. I went across once to pick up a cat, and when I lived in upstate New York, and I tried to come back in, and they kept me sitting there for half an hour trying to explain, why I hadn't bought anything at Tim Hortons besides a cup of hot chocolate at the duty free when I went to get this cat and to come back in. And the guy questioned me for half an hour. He didn't want to let me back in, and I lived in New York.
Yeah.
I was a US citizen. So sometimes it's hard to get across the border.
Yeah. Well, I looked up, speaking of New England and the Northeast, one of the towns they go to is Housatonic, Massachusetts. That's a mouthful. Oh. And it is a small place that had 1,100 people in the 2010 census. And its claim to fame seems to have been that there used to be a textile mill there. So
where that town is in the Berkshires. So it's very picturesque. The Berkshires are just, your pretty little mountains and trees, and like people go leaf peeping there. It's a place, antiquing. It's the kind of place where they'll have a lot of condos and timeshares because people want to go spend a week in October or a week in November because it's super pretty. I mean, it's just really, really, like when you think New England, it's one of those very quintessential New England areas where it's very pretty, woodsy, fall markets kind of place. And so I kind of liked it for swap meet because they were just fairly like a nice little town, and then these kids are doing these demonic rituals. But so it's a really
Western Mass.
Yes, Western Mass. And it's just there's some skiing up there in the winter and everything. It's just really, really nice.
Well, it's near the New York border.
Yeah. So yeah, Western Mass. So that's I thought that was nice because I just, you see them and they're in these nice houses, and these kids are just like, living these perfect little lives, except they're summoning demons. Doesn't end well.
That's what life is like there.
I'm sorry.
2 hours away before you drive to Boston.
There's nothing else to do, so kids get into trouble. What can I say? Kids these days.
And they don't raise a lot of cows there, so you can't go cow tipping.
No, too mountainous for the cows. Cows would be like in the the
over
flat.
the border into New York
Yeah.
and up into cow country where I lived around Ithaca. A lot of
Ah.
cows there.
So,
Now, another small town is Blue Earth, Minnesota.
Oh yes, where the militia is.
yes.
Wonderful militia.
Okay.
The was it the Whore of Babylon?
Yeah.
Yes. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh,
And apparently not much else. Again, very small town, a little bigger than last time, about 3,300 people. But
I was so struck by Blue Earth has a spot like in the supernatural lexicon. It's where Pastor Jim lived.
yes,
He lived there. The boys were there several times throughout their childhood because there's often been references to, you know, Pastor Jim was one of the ones that he would park the boys at, you know. And they
Which
never
always-
mentioned it. Like here they are in Blue Earth, and nobody, Sam and Dean never mention it. Nobody ever talks about it. There's no mention of the fact that this was a town that they would have been in. Like, how does that happen? How do you not have them talk about the fact that, oh, you know, boy, we haven't been here since, you know, we were 7 years old and Dad left us with Pastor Jim for 2 months or something like that.
which
I mean,
makes you wonder.
he was killed there. Meg killed him there
Did-
in
did
his church.
Jim maybe live out of town, or did he keep them in a cabin out of town? Maybe
No, everything was always Blue Earth, and they
Right,
never
we
even
can-
comes up.
we can retcon that into, well, when the boys came, he kept them at you know, his cabin out of town so they wouldn't have to deal with the explanation of why he suddenly had 2 kids. You know, there's a way to walk around it.
I
So,
guess, but I just was really surprised because we're still at this point in the first 5 years, which is before we get into the times and seasons where they start playing far more fast and loose with the show's
Hammond.
history. That even at that point, though, like nobody mentions Blue Earth. Like they could have.
Somebody liked the
Why even
name,
have it there then? Like,
or
why
there was,
didn't they just pick another town or
or
something if they weren't
somebody
going to
was
reference?
from there, or they liked the name, or there was a poster for it in somebody's office. There's history there that we don't know that brings them back there all the time. One of the
Well, this
scriptwriters'
is the only
mother
time.
lives
This
there.
is the only time on the show that we see them go back there. The
Yeah.
only other time we see it is when Pastor Jim is killed, when Meg kills him in his church in Blue
I'm telling
Earth.
you, one of the scriptwriters' mothers lives there, and it makes her feel good to hear them talk about it.
But it does make you wonder, okay, Sam and Dean spent maybe several months there on and off with Pastor Jim when they were kids. Did they cross paths with any of the people who in 99 Problems tried to kill them?
Well,
Were any of those familiar faces?
presumably they did, but apparently it didn't get written into the episode. So if we're good comic book people, we retcon a reason why they didn't.
I can even get that maybe because they were little and, you know, they didn't necessarily, I don't know, keep track of people or something, but just to even be like, oh, gee, next block over is where the church used to be or something.
Or maybe he called them by, you know, he gave them aliases or something, so nobody realizes it's the same guys because now they're grown up.
That would account for them, but I'm talking about Sam and Dean not saying anything, you know, when they've been there.
Or recognizing anyone?
Yeah.
Or
it was just
maybe,
kinda
you know,
funny.
they've been to a lot of places. And maybe, you know, they were just focused on Pastor Jim, and maybe he was like working on their shooting, or maybe he was teaching them something. Maybe he was teaching them history. We don't know. Maybe he was teaching them war, and they were focused on what they were doing with him because they were enjoying it, whatever it was. Maybe he
Now-
was teaching Sam schoolwork, which made him happy, and teaching Dean how to work on cars, which was making him happy.
Now in Hollywood, Hammer of the Gods, they go to Muncie, Indiana, which interestingly enough, I mean, Muncie seems kind of boring, but it was one time known as Little Chicago. And it was known for murderers, trials, prostitution, and gambling from the 1890s to the 70s with an incredibly corrupt folks
Well,
at the top.
that makes sense that the pagan gods would like that. I'm actually uncovered that it's basically like a meth capital. And there's just a ton of like it's just really down and out. And which makes sense because when Mercury sets up the whole the whole big fancy hotel, of course he does it in this derelict building, and we see it transform from dark, empty, rundown into the Elysian fields, with the mints on the pillow or the chocolate.
Well, that's like at the time they did the whole Sam and Lucifer showdown, setting the apocalypse in Detroit made a lot of sense, because Detroit in the mid-aughts was kind of looked like the apocalypse had come and gone, and they've made a lot of strides. I know the city is doing a lot of renovation and trying to save some of those big old abandoned buildings like the train station, and they've made strides since then. But at the time the episode was shot, the only other place I can think you could set it that would look more apocalyptic is maybe Braddock, Pennsylvania, if you've ever been there.
Depends on where you go in Detroit. There are parts of Detroit that are really nice.
Right.
The place where they held DETCON was gorgeous. And you can look right out the window across the river and look into Canada. It's beautiful there.
There's a lot of old infrastructure that has been kind of left to rot. And now they're trying to fix it, but that was
there's a lot of places that are trying to do that. Bethlehem has reclaimed the steel mills and turned them into performing venues, and it's beautiful.
Well, Pittsburgh has either reclaimed a lot of the land and turned them into software companies, software campuses where the steel mills used to be, or turned some of the steel mills into museums. So that's definitely true. And we can't miss mentioning, well, there is Davenport, Iowa, if anybody knows anything about Davenport, but Dean also makes his farewell tour to Cicero, Indiana, where people are bendy. Any thoughts on
he's just so crass, isn't he?
He is. Well, and somebody must have it in for Van Nuys, California, because of course that's where the storage crate, the cargo crate is that they made look like the beautiful room.
It looks like it's just really a real, warehouses, kind of place. It's just not, it's the low end of the San Fernando Valley, LA, that's not where anybody wants to live.
No, but that's not what it's like everywhere. That's just like what it's like out on the docks. I mean, you just have to hit the right part of anywhere. There are very few places that are totally
we're not putting it down. We're not putting it down. We're talking just about like why would they pick that location? I think the part of the amusement of it is that we have this very run-of-the-mill warehouse area, but then you walk, all of a sudden you have the beautiful room, so you don't expect to have the beautiful room in that kind of location, and you don't expect to like walk out of it and see that you're in this giant warehouse like they do when they're like, wait a minute, what? They think they're like in a palace or something because the room is so beautiful, right? And it's not. They're like, we're in this like warehouse. What the heck is going on here?
It's cheaper to get space down by the docks.
I also wonder if it's a bit of an in-joke. Every place has some other place they make fun of. And I wonder if you're from LA, if Van Nuys is one of those places.
I think it is. I bet it is. It's, yeah.
Well, of course it was in Van Nuys. That sort of
where else would it be?
Yeah. Every place has some other place.
Yeah, like every college has another college that's their rivals.
I'm sure if you're in Van Nuys, there's some other place that you're like, well, They're not
least
that nice. You know, we don't want to be there. We just don't know what it is.
Well, we would have
That's right.
expected it to be Buffalo, but they're using Buffalo for the location of John's storage area, so they couldn't
Yeah.
make it a place where the bad part of town is where they put the beautiful things. This they've already got it set up for something else.
And Lackawanna takes just too much effort to say.
And why on earth, I still want to know why on earth John parked a whole bunch of stuff in a corner of the country that's so difficult to get to, particularly in the winter months. Why he didn't put it someplace more central.
But Buffalo is one of the cities over the course of the series that they visit most often. So somebody had a tie to Buffalo. Yeah. Well, folks,
I have one last really
Yes.
quick little one I have to mention, because when I found this out, I thought it was hilarious. Fallen Idols, the Wax Museum, right? Paris Hilton, all of that, the wax figures that come alive and everything. There really is a wax museum there. There's really a wax museum there, only it's all Bible stuff. It's called Bible Walk. All of the figures are biblical, and like you have this whole little tour about like the life of Christ and all this kind of stuff, but it's a wax museum. And when I read that, I just was like, I cannot believe that they really found this town that really had the wax museum, and then they just made it be, you know,
Oh, geez, they could have
more
done the Lake
secular
George.
in nature.
There's one there.
Oh,
Then they
gosh.
could have worried about, Frankenstein coming to life.
Mhm.
So that was my final bit of amusement.
Well, folks, thanks so much. We've blown through our time again. And thank you so much for being here tonight and sharing your time with us. Tell us again how we can find you online, starting with Carole.
You can find me here on Facebook. I'm often on the Team Free Will and See Facebook group that Gail runs about supernatural things. And I'm also on many continual panels. You can find me on Twitter as true_firesign10. And all of my fiction is on AO3 under firesign10. Mind the tags.
And Elektra.
You can find anything you want to know at untilmidnight.com. It has links to all the things.
And I'm pretty easy to find at gailzmartin.com, morganbryce.com, all the social media, and I'm on a lot of it is one of those names or the other. So search for that, you'll find me. I'm in the Supernatural TFWNC group here on Facebook. I'm a columnist for the Winchester Family Business blog. And of course, I'm here on Continual. So thank you again for another wonderful evening. And thanks to all of you for watching and listening. There'll be more Supernatural coming up on Continual. So we'll see you online.